Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're really getting into a core myth, something central to how we think about mental health history,
We are. We're looking at the birth of the modern asylum.
but not the usual story, right? Not the heroic statues and celebrations.
Mhm.
We're using Michel Foucault's Madness and Civilization to look, well, underneath.
Exactly. Foucault challenges that whole narrative, the idea of a happy age when madness was finally recognized and treated.
Instead, he talks about the actual series of operations,
Mm.
the systems and quiet rules that really ran the asylum.
It's crucial to see past the surface. Foucault argues that what looked like liberation was actually a very clever shift in control.
So less about pure history, more about dissecting an illusion.
Precisely. An illusion built around two key figures whose actions carry these huge mythical values.
Okay, let's name them first.
Samuel Tuke. He was a Quaker in England, set up the retreat near York around 1792.
Right, the retreat. That became the model, didn't it, for humane treatment, seen as this act of ingenious benevolence.
It was founded by the Society of Friends, the Quakers, to offer this comforting, almost family-like place for members facing mental distress. Tried to blend care with economy.
Okay, Tuque in England, and the other big name?
Philippe Pinel in France. He's the one everyone pictures.
Ah, yes. The dramatic image Pinel at Bicêtre, later La Salpêtrière, during the Revolution.
Confronting the authorities and famously, supposedly, taking the chains off the patients, he's the icon of the psychiatric revolution.
Two very powerful images. Tuque's calm, religious setup, and Pinel's revolutionary act.
Very potent. But here's where we really dig in. The question Foucault forces us to ask.
Which is?
Why did these acts meant to be about freedom, about enlightenment? Why did they end up creating new kinds of confinement, new kinds of really strict moral segregation, constant observation, and, crucially, internalized control?
That's the twist. The physical chains, the obvious restraints, they disappear.
Right.
But something else takes your place, something working on the inside.
Exactly. The burden shifts. It's no longer about the external force, the wall, the chain. It becomes about internal moral guilt, about responsibility.
So the liberation wasn't really liberation at all.
It's what Foucault calls the paradox of deliverance. The chains fall, sure, but a new, maybe even tighter order clicks into place.
The terror just moves.
It moves from the prison gate to the conscience. Instead of fearing the whip, you fear your own failure, your own state of mind. You're handed this empty freedom, but it's a freedom defined by shame and the constant fear of messing up.
Okay, let's start with Tuque's system then. The retreat. You mentioned the setting near York, fertile and smiling countryside. Sounds idyllic.
It did, and deliberately so. Big walled garden, but importantly, no bars, no grills on the windows. It looked like the opposite of the old Bedlam-style places.
So on the surface, real reform.
Visually, yes, a huge step up from brutality, and it was funded by voluntary subscription, which adds to that philanthropic image.
But we need to look deeper than the aesthetics.
Absolutely, because the philosophy behind it was deeply Quaker. That means Tuque's system was, first and foremost, an instrument of moral and religious segregation.
So not physical walls, but ideological ones.
Mm-hmm.
What did that mean day to day?
It meant creating a bubble, a total environment reflecting Quaker purity and habits. They genuinely believed that mixing people with different beliefs, the profane and the serious, as they put it, could actually worsen or even cause madness.
Wow. So they thought external impurity could trigger it.
For sensitive souls, yes. They saw madness potentially stemming from moral imbalance, from suffering caused by, well, unquakerly thoughts or influences.
They were trying to build a moral fortress around the patient.
Pretty much. And the way it worked was through this double role of nature and rule. Nature was the calm setting, the garden, but the rule, capital R, was the Quaker faith itself, acting as this constant internalized principle of coercion.
Because the faith was so deeply ingrained.
Through generations of habit, strict upbringing, it wasn't just belief, it was the structure of life. And controlling violence, keeping things orderly through this relentless habit and principle that was seen as the actual cure.
So where the patient's own reason failed, the religious structure provided the backup, the thing that couldn't go mad.
Exactly. And it kept the individual in this state of, well, perpetual anxiety, always aware of the law, the rules, and the ever-present possibility of transgression.
Anxiety is a tool. That leads to the role of fear, doesn't it? Foucault highlights that.
He does. Fear was central. Not just brute fear, but it had a double power. It could manage the outright violence, the fury, but also that deeper, unsettling fear that madness itself brings.
So the old terror wasn't gone. It was just repurposed.
Repurposed and given a new job. The power of de-alienation, a very Foucault term.
De-alienation through fear. Explain that.
It means fear wasn't just about punishment. It was a psychological tool used to bridge the gap between the madman and the man of reason. It forced the patient to confront and ideally accept the rational social order represented by the keepers and the rules.
It made them recognize consequences.
Yes. And Tuke's anecdote about the manic patient illustrates this perfectly.
Ah, the famous one. Tell us.
Okay, so this man arrives at the retreat. He's literally loaded down with chains, handcuffs, ropes. He'd been incredibly violent, terrified his guards on the way there. Just the epitome of uncontrolled madness.
Right. And what happens at the retreat?
The moment he arrives, dramatically, all the restraints are taken off. He's allowed into the dining room, eats with the keepers like a guest.
Wow. And the effect?
Instant calm. His agitation just ceased immediately. And the reason given is fascinating.
Which was?
His attention was apparently just arrested by his new situation.
So the shock of the kindness, the removal of chains, that was the manipulation.
It was absolutely a tactic. It wasn't just kindness. It was a conditional offer. The keepers were implicitly saying, look, no chains, as long as you behave. As long as you follow the rules, respect morality.
They put the responsibilities squarely back on him.
Immediately. It was a new contract. And he was constantly reminded, subtly, of the deal. If he slipped up, if he failed to control himself, the old ways, the chains, the overt force were always implicitly threatened.
This is the key shift then. The assignment of guilt.
Exactly that. You're no longer guilty just for being mad. That's almost excused. But now you are morally responsible for everything you do or think that disrupts the order, the morality, the society of the retreat.
Delivered into freedom, but a freedom that constantly judges you.
A freedom organized as relentless self-monitoring. Any slip-up, a shout, an outburst not following the routine was immediately framed as a moral failing, linked back to the threat of punishment, the loss of this conditional liberty.
The stifling anguish of responsibility, as Foucault puts it.
It replaced the external terror. The old fears weren't gone. They were just locked inside, under the watchful eye of the keeper and, more importantly, the patient's own newly burdened conscience.
Okay, so Tuke's system was subtle, psychological, religious. Pinel's legacy, though, feels much more physical, at least in its iconic moment. That confrontation with Couthon at Bicêtre.
It's the image that sticks, isn't it? Couthon, the revolutionary official, is horrified. You want to unchain these beasts, he supposedly asks Pinel, fearing for his life.
And Pinel's reply is pure Enlightenment optimism.
Citizen, I am convinced that these madmen are so intractable only because they have been deprived of air and liberty. Classic line. And then he supposedly frees 50 patients from their chains.
Based on that, you'd expect genuine liberation to follow. Freedom, air.
Right, but Foucault cuts straight through that. He insists this famous liberation wasn't freedom, it was just a more effective way to transfer terror.
How so? The chains literally came off.
They did. But what replaced them was the institution itself, structured to enforce terror internally. Pinel's asylum wasn't about freeing madness. It was about replacing its raw, outward expression with the inward, stifling anguish of responsibility, the fear of moral failure.
So the goalposts moved completely. Deliverance had this hidden, paradoxical meaning.
Entirely paradoxical. You're physically free, but now you're psychologically confined in a new way.
Explain that confinement.
Well, taking off the chains didn't free the madman from the asylum. It trapped him inside herself. It made him solely responsible for his own state. He was told, in effect, okay, you're free now. Free to be reasonable.
Ah, so any lapse after that point isn't illness anymore.
It's framed as a choice, a moral failing, a transgression, an act that brings shame. That becomes the new crime inside the asylum walls, not being mad, but failing to control it according to the rules.
Now, Pinel didn't use Tuke's quicker framework.
Yep.
He rejected the religious angle, right?
He did. He wanted a secular system. Religion was something to be studied clinically, perhaps, but not the basis of the asylum's morality.
But he still needed a moral foundation. So he substituted. What?
The dominant values of the time. The values of the rising French bourgeoisie, moral segregation based on things like family structure, the importance of work, conforming to social norms.
So the asylum becomes a kind of microcosm of respectable society.
Exactly. It was meant to represent the continuity of social morality. No more wild exceptions. The old acceptance of madness having its own space was gone.
And things like drinking, idleness, debauchery.
Yeah.
Those weren't symptoms to be treated.
No. Under this model, they were seen as the causes of insanity. And if they're causes stemming from moral weakness, then they need to be punished or at least corrected through moral force.
So the internal workings of the asylum, the strict routines, the work.
All designed to impose this homogeneous rule of morality. Madness gets redefined as a failure to live up to these bourgeois virtues, and the asylum's job is to compel submission to that code. Panel, the great liberator, ends up being the great enforcer of conservative social values.
Okay, so Pinel sets up this moral framework. But how did he actually enforce it? He needed tools, mechanisms to make patients internalize this guilt.
He did, and Foucault identifies 3 primary psychological tools or operations that were remarkably effective. They show how the staff, the keepers, the doctors were meant to intervene to create this moral synthesis.
Replacing brute force with psychological management. What's the first one?
The first is silence.
Silence. That sounds passive.
Deceptively so. It wasn't about peace and quiet. In Pinel's asylum, silence was a fundamental, almost punitive structure. It was about withholding response, creating an absence of language from the rational world.
Why? What does that achieve?
Pinel understood something crucial. You can't reason with delirium. If you argue with a delusion, you give it status. You engage with it. Silence, however, refuses to play the game.
It isolates the patient within their own unreason.
Precisely. It forces them into this kind of mute dialogue with themselves because the outside world simply won't validate their experience. It creates pressure, a need for the patient to break that silence, ideally through confession, not more delusion.
The anecdote about the ecclesiastic really brings this home.
It does. This man, a former cleric, had been chained up at Bicêtre for 12 years. He had powerful delusions, thought he was Christ.
Okay, so Pinel takes off his chains.
The symbolic liberation. But then, crucially, Pinel ordered expressly that everyone imitate his own reserve and not address a word to this poor madman. Total silence from the staff.
So physically free, but utterly isolated psychologically.
Exactly. And think about it, the chains, the other prisoners reacting to him, maybe mocking him, maybe fearing him. That was, in a strange way, part of his performance of being Christ. It gave him an audience.
Silence took that away.
Completely. No audience, no reaction, no validation. He was just ignored, humiliated by the lack of engagement. His delusion lost its power because it had no external echo.
So the silence forces him back towards reality.
Or at least towards acknowledging the gap. Foucault says he eventually rejoined the other patients, started having more sensible and true ideas. The silence exposed the limits of his freedom and implicitly highlighted his guilt, the guilt of not conforming to the shared reality. He wasn't chained by iron anymore, but by that oppressive silence pushing him towards shame and submission.
Okay, silence is the first tool. What's the second mechanism Pinel used?
The second is what Foucault terms recognition by mirror.
Recognition by mirror, making the patient see themselves.
Yes, but in a very specific, controlled, and ultimately humiliating way. It's about forcing madness to confront itself, not as something unique or powerful, but as a spectacle, an object for observation.
How does that differ from just, self-awareness?
In the past, someone in the grips of a delusion might even find a strange sort of glory in it. Pinel's system aimed to strip that away. It forced the patient to see their madness reflected back at them, often through the reactions of others or even through seeing other mad people.
Making them an object of their own condition, that does sound humiliating.
Deeply. The classic example Foucault uses is the story of the 3 patients who all believed they were Louis VI.
Right. 3 deposed kings in one asylum. How did Pinel handle that?
Well, a keeper, very cleverly, takes one of them aside, speaks to him respectfully, conspiratorially almost.
And says what?
Something like, "Sire, why do you lower yourself arguing with these other men? They're clearly mad. Everyone knows you are the true Louis VI.
Ah, so he doesn't directly challenge the delusion.
No, he uses the other 2 patients as the mirror. He flatters the first man's ego, confirming his sanity by contrasting it with the obvious madness of the others.
And the first patient buys it.
He does. He accepts the compliment, feels superior, and withdraws from the other 2 imposters.
But in doing that,
In accepting that the others are mad, he implicitly accepts the keeper's judgment and, by extension, recognizes that his own claim must also be a pretense, a baseless pretense, because he's separating himself based on rationality.
wow. He's tricked into seeing his own delusion by judging it in others.
Exactly. He's forced to recognize himself in the mirror of his madness. His false sovereignty collapses. He acknowledges his guilt and shame, not because someone told him he was mad, but because he accepted the position of being the observer of madness, thus objectifying himself.
trapped in self-observation.
An infinitely self-referring observation, as Foucault puts it. The shame of being seen and seeing oneself as just an object of delusion becomes a powerful force for conformity.
Okay, silence forces internal dialogue. The mirror forces self-objectification. What's the third pillar of Pinel's system?
The third is perpetual judgment. This is where the asylum explicitly takes on the role of a court.
A court, you mean like trials?
Not formal trials, but the entire atmosphere, the structure, was designed to function as a constant, invisible tribunal, a microcosm of the judicial system, always watching, always judging.
Judging based on what?
Based on that moral code, we talked about work ethic, social conformity, obedience. The madman was perpetually on trial before this invisible panel of moral and increasingly scientific conscience.
And punishment was part of the treatment.
Absolutely central. Methods often borrowed directly from the police or criminal justice system were repackaged as therapeutic techniques. The threat of the director's authority, the disciplinary measures, it was all framed as treatment.
This brings us to the cold shower, doesn't it? That iconic, often feared asylum practice. Foucault has a specific take on this.
He does, and it's crucial. We tend to think, maybe charitably, that it was some kind of primitive hydrotherapy aimed at the nervous system.
Right, a medical intervention.
Foucault says no, not primarily. Its origins and function were explicitly punitive, borrowed straight from the ordinary police juridical tribunal.
From the police. How so?
In the 18th and early 19th centuries, dousing people with cold water was a standard police punishment for things like public drunkenness, vagrancy, insubordination, essentially, minor social or moral transgressions.
So when the asylum doctor ordered a cold shower,
He wasn't primarily thinking medically. He was deploying a recognized tool of social control and punishment. It was meant to shock the patient into submission, to make them recognize their transgression against the asylum's order, and ultimately against the broader social laws of work and morality.
he was discipline disguised as therapy.
Precisely. A physical reminder that the rules of society applied even here, and that rebellion would be met with consequences that mimicked judicial penalties, forcing an acceptance of guilt.
The anecdote about the hysterical woman seems to fit this perfectly.
It does. You have this young woman described as having a mild character, but she has these violent fits of hysteria, sometimes with loud cries.
Which today we'd see purely as a symptom.
But in Pinel's asylum, the fit itself was viewed as a transgression, a rebellion against order and submission. So the director treats it not as illness, but as willful defiance. He confronts her with energetic firmness, threatening greatest severity.
Punishment for a symptom.
Exactly. And the result, her agitation stops immediately. She bursts into tears, full of remorse, for 2 hours.
The system worked, in its own terms.
It completed the cycle perfectly. Transgression, the fit, is met with punishment, the threat, the judgment. This forces recognition of guilt, which leads to internal remorse. The goal wasn't just to stop the behavior, but to create an inmate who policed their own thoughts and feelings, constantly aware of this internal tribunal, terrified of moral condemnation.
So these three mechanisms, silence, mirror, judgment, create this intense internal pressure. And overseeing it all is the figure of the physician. Foucault calls the 19th century the apotheosis of the medical personage.
It really is a pivotal shift. Suddenly, the doctor isn't just a healer. They become this key figure, almost a judge, controlling access to the asylum itself. Remember, you needed a medical certificate to get in.
Giving them gatekeeping power.
Huge power. But, and this is critical, Foucault argues that initially this power wasn't based on actual medical breakthroughs or superior scientific knowledge.
No, then what was it based on?
On moral authority. On being seen as embodying virtue, probity, good character. The doctor was powerful because he represented the moral order the asylum was trying to impose. Curing the insane was seen as an enormous moral task.
So the doctor was less a scientist, more a moral guardian.
In the beginning, yes. He became the focal point for all the authority structures of the time. He was effectively father, judge, family, and law, all rolled into one person within the asylum walls.
All that bourgeois value system, father knows best, transgressions must be punished, social order is paramount, it all gets channeled through the doctor.
Precisely. Pinel explicitly used authority and punishment as tools. Look at the case Foucault mentions of the 17-year-old girl.
What was her situation?
She had this giddy, mad delirium, which Pinel attributed to her parents being too indulgent, lacking authority.
So the family itself was seen as the problem.
Yes, corrupted authority. So the treatment involved the asylum, specifically the keeper acting under the doctor's orders, using extreme severity and absolute authority to break her emotional dependence on her parents.
Forcing her loyalty to shift.
Exactly. She had to transfer her allegiance from her actual family to the institutional father figure, the doctor. Compliance with his authority was the cure.
And her cure involved confessing something.
Yes, she made a frank confession about a forbidden romance being the cause of her distress. Foucault points out that her recovery was attributed directly to the doctor successfully manipulating the prestige surrounding family secrets, authority, punishment, love, all used as moral levers, not medical ones.
It really sounds like social engineering, not medicine. But then science starts to become more dominant positivism, the belief in empirical knowledge. How did that change things?
This is maybe the most fascinating part of the transformation. You'd think more science would make the doctor's role clearer, more rational.
But it didn't.
No. Foucault argues it made the psychiatrist's power more obscure, more mystifying. The old moral authority, which was somewhat transparent based on societal values, gets hidden behind a new veil of scientific expertise.
So the doctor changes from a moral leader into, well,
Into a thaumaturge, a miracle worker.
wow.
The authority now seems to come not from society, but from the doctor's own special, almost magical, unchallengeable knowledge of the human mind. Foucault uses strong language power becoming divine and satanic beyond human measure.
And the patient facing this figure.
Is expected to submit completely. Believing the doctor holds the secret key to their cure, they offer profound surrender. This total submission, now framed as necessary for scientific treatment, becomes the ultimate condition for getting better.
So the moral control just went underground, masked by science.
Exactly. The doctor inherited all the coercive power of Tuke and Pinel, but the mechanism became invisible, technical, scientific. His power became total, unquestionable, and arguably even more potent.
Okay, let's try and pull this together. This whole exploration really flips the script on the birth of psychiatric care. These great liberations by Tuke and Pinel.
Weren't really liberations in the way we think.
No, they were the start of a huge, intricate system of moral imprisonment. It swapped the obvious terror chains and dungeons for a much subtler internal terror.
The terror of guilt, of social responsibility, of constantly being judged against a moral standard.
The asylum, then, becomes the place where society's preferred moral code gets stamped onto anyone who deviates.
It became the moral uniform of the rising bourgeois society, as Foucault puts it, and remarkably effective. These core structures, the silence, the mirror, the judgment, the absolute medical authority, they didn't just vanish.
They lasted.
Oh, yes. They deeply influenced mainstream non-psychoanalytic psychiatry well into the 20th century. The basic model persisted for a very long time.
Until someone came along to really shake things up. We should briefly mention Freud here.
Yes, Freud is the figure Foucault points to as dismantling these specific asylum structures. Psychoanalysis fundamentally changed the game.
Oh, so?
Well, think about it. Freud abolished the rule of silence language, free association, became the core method. He got rid of the mirror. The goal wasn't to humiliate the patient by reflecting their delusion, but to understand its meaning. And he silenced the condemnation analysis wasn't about moral judgment or shame in the same way.
So he broke down Pinel's tools. But did he actually free the patient from alienation?
Foucault's take is nuanced. He'd say, no, Freud didn't end alienation. He just alienated the alienation itself.
What does that mean?
It means the power structures didn't disappear, they just shifted again. The doctor, the analyst, still holds immense authority, perhaps even more concentrated within the framework of the transference relationship. The focus moves inward to personal history, desire, the unconscious, but the dynamic of expert authority and patient submission remains, just in a different psychological arena.
So even with Freud, the fundamental issue Pinel and Tuke wrestled with, how society deals with unreason, with experiences outside the norm that hasn't gone away.
Not at all. And if the historical cure for madness was largely about enforcing social and moral conformity, disguised as treatment, well, that raises big questions about what sanity really means. Even today, it's always partly a social construct.
Which brings us to the final thought, the question for you listening. The old asylums with their visible walls and cold showers are mostly gone.
Mostly. But if the asylum was fundamentally a mechanism of social control wrapped in benevolence, that mechanism probably didn't just disappear. It likely evolved.
So the provocative question is, what are the modern versions of that moral tribunal? Where does that pressure to conform, that internalized judgment, operate now?
Think about it. Where are we constantly observed, measured, judged, maybe without even realizing it?
Digital life comes to mind immediately. Social media, for instance. Your performance is constantly rated likes, followers.
Yeah.
Deviate too far from the acceptable script, and you face public shaming, cancellation. It's a kind of anonymous, perpetual moral judgment, isn't it?
It certainly shares characteristics. Or consider the whole wellness industry, the relentless pressure for self-optimization.
Ah, the modern recognition by mirror.
Could be. Constantly urged to monitor ourselves, find our flaws, our anxieties, our productivity dips. We hold ourselves guilty against this ideal of perfect mental health and efficiency, internalizing the judgment.
And maybe the corporate world. The demand for emotional labor, for always presenting the right attitude, conforming to company values, often framed in therapeutic or well-being language.
It's another potential parallel, the structure of internalized guilt, of needing to police your own thoughts and feelings to fit in, that didn't vanish with the asylum walls. It just spread out, became part of the cultural air we breathe.
So the core tension remains. How do we, as a society, engage with distress, with difference, with unreason, without falling back on moral condemnation and demanding submission through shame?
It's the enduring question, and until we find better answers, the ghost of Pinel's moral prison might still be shaping the boundaries of what we consider acceptable. Something to definitely think about, what invisible chains might still be influencing how you think and feel.